Good morning, Nathan. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Jürgen, and yourself?
I'm well. I'm off to a good start in the new year, of which the first month has already passed. Isn't it incredible?
Absolutely.
But that's how life goes. We're
Sure.
come here to speak about some international law issues. And last time when we spoke in the old year, we already talked about the matters, the controversy going on with the South China Sea.
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about a submatter, not as such, and in the narrow sense, South China Sea, but still close enough to put it in the same general basket.
Sure.
But what we're going to talk about today is the Scarborough Shoal.
Yes.
And perhaps we could briefly say a few words what the Scarborough Shoal is and where it is.
Sure. So Scarborough Shoal is a geographical maritime feature that consists of a large coral reef formation with a massive internal lagoon. There are a number of rocks that surround the lagoon that are above water at high tide. And an international tribunal, an arbitral tribunal, has declared that Scarborough Shoal in international maritime law is a rock. And therefore it has a 12 nautical mile maritime or territorial sea around it. So it doesn't have any of the expanded or ambulated maritime zones that the international maritime law would endow to such a feature.
So you mentioned very technically already, you mentioned that it is a maritime feature.
Sure.
So why would we use a term like that? Why don't we say it's an island?
Yes.
You also mentioned the term rock.
Yes.
So
Yes.
maybe we can explain a little bit what the difference is.
Sure.
And why we use generic terms such as maritime feature.
Sure. There has been a significant case in international maritime law, and that's the case concerning the Philippines and China, which was decided by a specialist tribunal that was formed under the main convention that the international maritime law deals with, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that tribunal decided that certain features in the South China Sea were either low tide elevations, rocks, or fully entitled islands. And I should say that the convention we're talking about distinguishes features and obviously defines what they are, and therefore endows them with certain maritime zones that can then be claimed regarding fishing and exploitation of resources.
And that is all resources, underground, in the water.
Correct, yes.
And that's what makes them so important. And of course,
Right.
in the broader South China Sea,
Sure.
the strategic dimension is not to be underestimated.
Absolutely.
It's very intense shipping routes, international trade routes.
Yes.
And there's a lot of concern that if China were to prevail, legally or non-legally in getting, if you will, exclusive control over that whole area.
Yes.
What can we say? Where exactly is that area? Or the Scarborough Shoal, for that matter?
So it is in the area known as the South China Sea, which is a massive maritime zone. It is hundreds of thousands of square kilometres in volume. It's a significant waterway, and as you said, it's a major shipping route in international trade, shipborne trade.
It's a bit off to the north of where, for example, the Spratly Islands are.
Sure.
And there's about just under 900 kilometres
Yes.
between the Scarborough Shoal, that coral reef feature,
Yes.
and the nearest point on the Chinese coast.
Sure, that's
It's
right.
how far from the Philippine coast?
It's about 100 kilometres from the Philippine
100
coast.
kilometres from the Philippine coast.
Oh, so it's about 250. But the feature we're next going to talk about is 100 kilometres, so we'll come to that as well.
Okay.
Yep.
So, it lies there pretty lonely.
Absolutely.
The Scarborough Shoal,
Yes.
and as the picture shows, it is, if you will, a ring-fenced part of the sea.
Absolutely.
With a very small little gap at the bottom through which small vessels could enter.
Yes.
Inside of that ring-fenced wall, of course, it's a natural wall,
Yes.
a coral reef wall, which is above water. Most of them.
Yes.
Most of the time. It's very rich in fishing.
Internally, because of the structure of that feature, a lot of the good resources, a lot of the fish resources, are inside.
Inside.
that
So
lagoon.
currently, what we're having is little ships go into that little entrance gap that
Yes.
naturally exists, do their fishing, and the mother ships wait outside,
That's
if
correct,
you will,
yes.
and that little entrance is currently practically controlled by the Chinese, but they don't yet exercise total exclusivity, but they do control who gets in and who doesn't.
That's correct as well. There was something called the Scarborough Shoal standoff in early 2012. That involved Chinese fishers being excluded from entering the shoal, which is a traditional fishing ground. And I should say other countries in the region have used that area for traditional fishing as well. So there's multi-use in history of these. Of course, being situated so close to the Philippines, would be the Philippines who use it quite frequently.
Yeah. So if we go back to the decision by the arbitral tribunal in The Hague, established or endowed with jurisdiction under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas.
Yes.
Now, still, that jurisdiction is not mandatory, and hence we've had the situation here that whereas they reached this arbitration decision that was on proceedings instituted by the Philippines,
correct, yes,
the Chinese did not participate.
No.
In those proceedings.
That's correct. Yes.
And what does that mean for the whole affair?
So if we go to the convention, one of the key issues that was negotiated was the fact that there is compulsory dispute settlement. One part of the convention deals just with that. And it was agreed between all signatories that the scope of any departure from that would be very limited. And what China has said regarding the arbitration is that they pulled that scope in and said, well, that's something that we haven't agreed to arbitrate, yet the convention itself does not permit that type of exception to the compulsory jurisdiction for arbitration. So the Philippines triggered that compulsory jurisdiction, and the China simply resisted and gave a number of reasons why they resisted. Ultimately, the tribunal rejected those reasons that China came forward with, but in any event, China has completely disregarded and disavowed any award that was handed down by the tribunal. That's correct.
So we're having, if you will, a controversy on top of the controversy, the procedural controversy over the jurisdiction or not of the tribunal.
Yes.
And as you pointed out, the tribunal itself thought it did have jurisdiction. That's why it went ahead to decide the case.
Yes.
But it did not, am I correct in saying that, did not treat the arbitration in the way of a kind of like of a default judgment. It went through great length to try to include anything and everything that could be possibly attributed to the Chinese position.
Absolutely.
And I guess from a political perspective, you could say, the only chance to raise the authority of their findings is if it can be sold and can be shown to have included the views, concerns, and positions of the side, even though that side didn't participate. So it's a bit different from private proceedings.
Absolutely.
If you didn't participate in proceedings we'd have, you would just lose out.
Yes.
But that was not specifically not what the tribunal did here. So it's a very lengthy judgment.
Yes.
Now, what exactly did they say? You mentioned bits and pieces of it about the Scarborough Shoal thing, because it went beyond the Scarborough Shoal.
That's correct.
Spratly Islands and other parts.
Yes.
Contentious between the Philippines and China.
Absolutely.
But what did they specifically say to the Scarborough Shoal?
So
and when they, if I might add,
sure.
Them saying that is their interpretation of the relevant provisions in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas.
Absolutely.
Because that's their basis.
Yes,
these are the substantive provisions on which they made their finding.
Yes, absolutely. So basically the Philippines case was that Scarborough Shoal lies within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And that is a 200 nautical mile maritime zone that a coastal state or an archipelagic state like the Philippines can claim as their maritime area, their maritime zone. And as we've said before, the exclusive economic zone is exactly that. It gives that country exclusive use of and exploitation of resources within the water column and beneath the sea floor as well.
So in that sense, it is very standard, if you will, because the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone is an established. It's basically the generalization of what used to be known as the continental shelf.
Yes.
It doesn't now make any difference whether there actually is a continental shelf as a geological feature.
Yes.
Which we can find in a lot of places, but not in all places. Now it doesn't matter anymore. All states, regardless of whether there is that geological feature or not, get the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. That means all the exercise of sovereignty there is limited, or in essence, it is almost nil, with the one big exception, of course, the economic exploitation of living and non-living resources in the water column and below the ground, the floor, the seabed. In that area. So in that sense, it doesn't matter what the Scarborough Shoal is, in that sense. Once you say it's within the 200-mile zone, the question of who actually should be controlling the entry into that ring fence, if you will, in double quotation marks, is answered. But there is, of course, a potential consequence that the qualification of the Scarborough Shoal as a particular feature versus not would have, and namely, does it have the capacity to extend that 200 miles 200 miles away from the Scarborough Shoal, which it could do, correct me if I'm wrong, which it could do if it were qualified an island.
That's correct.
If it were qualified an island, the Philippine 200-mile zone would then extend 200 nautical miles beyond the Scarborough Shoal.
That's correct as well, yes.
And my understanding is that did not happen.
No. So the tribunal meticulously assessed and interpreted the convention. And also of course, the geographical location of the feature itself. That's not moved, so that's accessible. And under the convention, the tribunal determined that this feature is rock, as it cannot sustain human habitation or an economic life of its own. There are certain parts of Scarborough Shoal that are above water at high tide, but they would require significant man-made manipulation to support life. So
the concept of an island in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas requires that feature that is to be qualified an island be above ground, above waterline at all times, because that is the prerequisite for the actual substantive criterion. It must be able to support human life without artificial input. So that's not to be taken literally, that whoever is there must be able to nourish and feed and drink off the land, but it would require fresh water to some degree. It would require some a possibility to grow something, and not just a rock, some vegetation. It would not necessarily mean that you have to be able to sustain the whole population of that particular island. I mean, we know we have many, the Galapagos Islands, they couldn't sustain the amount of people living there, much less the tourists that go there. But they could, they are always above the waterline. There's vegetation, there's fresh water, and all of these things. So it's a bit of a semi-practical, theoretical aspect of what an island is. And the tribunal held that Scarborough Shoal is not an island in that sense. Even that which is above water at all times, there's nothing there that could sustain anything.
No, I mean, if you had a large boulder out of the water at all times, there would be no sand, there would be no vegetation. So it would be a pointless exercise trying to classify that type of feature as an island under the convention. It's simply not compatible.
So what are the Chinese putting forward?
So the Chinese, from a very early stage in the tribunal process, reiterated their claim of the now infamous 9-dashed line, which is a large 9-dashed line area that surrounds about 90% of the South China Sea. So we're talking a significant portion of the South China Sea. China claims within the 9-dash line, but China has been very elusive about what that actually means. So the tribunal had to look at public pronouncements from government officials, Chinese government officials. They had to look at protests that China had instigated against other claimants in the area regarding their continental shelf issues, and also what other commentators have said. Other Chinese scholars have said about those particular features, but principally the official government pronouncements by China is what the tribunal assessed in
which
assessing that.
which raises some interesting questions, because what we see going on, if you will, in the media, you know, the politics,
Sure.
the politics of it are, one might say on a good day, a bit humorous, because whatever the underlying legalities are. So, for example, if all of that was exclusive economic zone for China, let's just assume that.
Yes, absolutely.
That would mean, yes, they would have all the resources, but everybody could still navigate through there.
Absolutely.
Because the right of navigation is even granted in your territorial waters. So the highest form of water, which is outside of your baseline,
Yes.
the rest is considered land, if
Yes.
you will, but you know, the low water mark
Yes.
and certain extensions of it around internal bays,
Yes.
everything within that low water mark is treated like fully sovereign, like state territory.
Absolutely, yes.
The minute you leave that lower baseline, you get into the territorial waters.
Yes.
Already there, you must contend with other nations sailing through to navigate. There are some restrictions on the navigation.
Sure.
For example, warships have to keep their weapons down.
Sure.
But you can navigate through.
Absolutely.
As you go to the contiguous zone and as you go
Yes.
to the exclusive economic zone,
Yes.
much less so for navigation purposes. They are the high sea for navigation purposes.
Absolutely. Yes.
So when Western countries, the United States and Australia is participating, are holding freedom of navigation exercises,
Yes.
one could be inclined to think that under the existing regime,
Sure.
those exercises are unnecessary. So they must be contemplating and
Yes.
putting their foot on the ground,
Yes.
not to defend the status quo, but they must be thinking that the Chinese are aiming to treat this almost like an internal lake, you know, like a big lake
Yes.
on the mainland,
Yes.
where of course one couldn't navigate.
No.
Is there any indications that this is what the Chinese, or do we just not know?
We don't know, and that's the point. Is the Chinese have been particularly careful not to spell out, not to clarify what their claim is in that area. We've heard the Chinese officials talking about this South China Sea 9-dash line area as being of ancient part of Chinese territory, and that's in fact taught in Chinese schools as well. So this is part of the
So that is kind of like the domestic lake analogy.
Absolutely.
This is like it might as well be the lake behind Beijing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we've also there's been evidence of what happens is Chinese sailors, mariners, have gone down to the bottom of the 9-dash line, recited an oath, raised a flag, and those sorts of traditional type activities that would be within the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia, right down the bottom of the 9-dash line. So we've seen an array of very conflicting messages from China about what that 9-dash line means, and the freedom of navigation operations are in essence a protest to ambulated claims of territory by China. It's also being a major international shipping route. It is to show and illustrate that this is obviously a very important waterway.
They do,
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong, but China has protested against these freedom of navigation exercises.
They have, yes.
Which makes legally no sense at all, right? Because if a Chinese vessel decided to circumnavigate Australia, they could freely do so.
Absolutely.
There's nothing to demonstrate here. That is just standard, long-standing law of the seas procedure that you can navigate around, depending on how far away from the coast they are. They might have to, put a cover on their cannon and raise certain flags.
Yes.
But they can circumnavigate Australia with practically no restrictions.
Absolutely.
So the only thing you could say, if they did this with their fleet, a military fleet, you might say it's a bit of an unfriendly act. If it's uncoordinated and not part of larger exercises, which sometimes also happens.
That's right.
So in essence, we've got to watch that space. There's something going on
absolutely.
that I think is in line with the Chinese approach of politics, which is long-term.
Absolutely long-term.
And that is something we grapple with in the West, where our outlook tend to be shorter term, maybe medium term on a good day.
Yes.
Whereas the Chinese are in there, they're looking 50, 100 years ahead.
Absolutely.
150 years ahead.
Sure.
currently the legalities here are fairly straightforward.
Yes.
Leave the qualification of certain features that,
Sure.
there can be borderline features, how many palms make a livable island.
Yes.
But short of standard delineation exercises that we're used with within law, the legalities here are fairly clear in terms of navigation.
Yes.
They become less clear in terms of exploitation of resources.
Yes.
And they become less clear if we look at the long game.
Yes.
If we look 100 years, whether China will be able to basically take this whole vast area of high sea and treat it as if it was a domestic lake.
Yes. And of course, in the South China Sea, other neighbouring countries like Vietnam, obviously the Philippines, Taiwan.
Which, of course, is not a neighbouring country, might add.
Well, there's
only one China?
There's another technical issue there as well.
Yes.
I guess that's another podcast,
yes,
maybe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So other countries around the South China Sea, and there's 9 of them, 7 or 9, but they've built, to varying forms, their own structures and things on these features. The Chinese have gone 100 times off the scale as far as artificial building is concerned. And
which we know legally will not change.
That's correct.
The qualification of the feature. You can throw as much concrete on there as you want.
That's correct, yes.
It is not supposed to change the qualification.
That's
of course,
correct.
we know in law, again, the long game, the normative power of the facts.
Sure.
And if you're in there for the long game, and there's maybe a little city on there down the line on all the concrete, and all of a sudden there are palms there, then it might change down the line anyway. But as the law stands, just putting some bricks and mortar on a rock does not turn it in an island, even if you bring some flowers with you.
Exactly, and the tribunal is very clear about that. So no amount of human transformation of a feature will change that feature's status in maritime law. In international maritime law, does not change.
All right. Well, look, I think we'll have to follow this a bit more, and as new developments come up, we might come back and talk a little bit more about the South China Sea. For now, this is the kickoff for this year's Murdoch Law Podcast.
Sure.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you again.
And if you have any questions, send us an email.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye bye.